Hello, everybody. Have you ever wondered, what is my risk for diabetes complications? I find that most people really overestimate their risk for diabetes complications and at the same time really underestimate their ability to decrease that risk. So I'm going to tackle this in today's episode. And the diabetes dilemma I have today is from a listener who wants to know if primary care providers are well equipped to help people manage type 2 diabetes, or if it's better to see a specialist. This is also an episode sponsored by MedIQ. Thank you, MedIQ. Remember, MedIQ is conducting an anonymous survey and would appreciate your input. So check out the link in the podcast description. That survey takes less than 15 minutes. It's going to be asking you about your experiences with diabetes and your healthcare team, which is going to help them develop future educational pieces for their programs. You also have the opportunity after that survey to enter a gift card drawing. 1 of 10 $100 Visa gift cards will be given away. So check out that link in the podcast description. Use your voice, be heard. Let's get started.
Welcome to Type 2 and You with Meg, a diabetes podcast with the tools and guidance you need for your best life with type 2 diabetes. Your host, Megan Munoz, is a Dartmouth-trained health coach and master-prepared certified diabetes educator. She's helped thousands of people turn their diabetes fears, questions, and concerns into hope, confidence, and action. Ready to support your type 2 journey? Here's Meg.
The first couple episodes after Mila's interview is going to require you to have a pen and a paper. So this is one of those episodes. I want you to grab a pen and a piece of paper, and I want you to write down something for me. So I'll give you a second. You can pause me if you need to. Once you have that pen and paper, I want you to write the following words. I want you to write amputation. I want you to write ESRD below it, and ESRD stands for end-stage renal disease. And end-stage renal disease is when someone's kidneys aren't working well enough to help keep their body healthy and they end up needing dialysis. I want you to also write down heart disease or stroke. And the last thing I want you to write down is visual impairment. Well, this sounds like a podcast you really want to start your day with, doesn't it? All these terrible things you're writing down on your piece of paper. But stick with me. Don't give up on me yet. Now, imagine yourself, among 1,000 people with diabetes and write down how many people you think out of that 1,000 people actually have each of these complications. So again, write it down next to each of these pieces. How many people out of 1,000 people with diabetes end up being hospitalized for an amputation? How many people out of 1,000 people end up developing end-stage renal disease? What percent of people with diabetes end up having heart disease or a stroke? And what percent of people do you think have trouble with their vision? Once you have those written down, keep those handy because I'm going to go through the Center for Disease Control and Prevention's actual statistics on these diabetes complications. The reason this is so important is because I find that many people with diabetes significantly overestimate their risk for diabetes complications. This is the whole point of the pen and paper because I want you to actually write down what you think the risks are, because I would almost bet that you are significantly overestimating the risk of these complications. Let's find out. When we look at amputations and hospitalizations for amputations, only about 5 out of 1,000 people will have that experience. Does that surprise you? 5 out of 1,000 people. Moving down your list, if you took 1,000 people with diabetes in the United States, the number of people that develop end-stage renal disease is about 2 out of 1,000. So 2 people out of 1,000. I don't know how you're doing on your list, but I'm going to guess you probably estimated higher than those. Now we come down to the number one complication of diabetes, which is heart disease and stroke. So cardiovascular disease, or diseases of the blood vessels and the heart. About 30% of people with diabetes in the US will develop heart disease or have a stroke. 30%, so 1 out of 3. Now that is a huge jump compared to our other numbers that we just talked about. But I am going to share with you some information that will hopefully help you understand how you can mitigate or decrease that risk. So the last one was the visual impairment. And about 25% of people will have that experience as well. So 25%, again, a higher number than the first two. So, are you surprised by the numbers compared to what you wrote down on your list? I would bet that you would be. Here's the kicker. Unfortunately, you can't take these numbers and say, okay, well, my chance of end-stage renal disease, I'm probably going to be one of the 998 people that don't develop end-stage renal disease out of every 1,000 people. You don't know that for sure because there are things that affect your risk for diabetes complications. One of those pieces is kind of like your social environment. So what opportunities do you have to maintain your health? For example, people who don't have healthcare tend to have a higher risk of diabetes complications. So that's really important to know, that there's social pieces that may or may not be as easily changeable for you, but there are a lot of things that you can do to decrease your risk of diabetes complications. And so if we think about heart disease, for example, being one of the biggest complications of diabetes, well, there was a study done in Sweden in 2018, and I can put a link for that in the podcast description. And it looked at over 250,000 people with type 2 diabetes and their risk for death, heart attacks, and stroke. Now, I'm sure the researchers probably anticipated that they would see the same numbers that I just told you, that, 1 out of 3 people roughly with diabetes would actually develop heart disease or have trouble with a stroke. But what they found was that the people that had healthy A1C levels, healthy blood pressure levels, healthy cholesterol levels, did not smoke, and did not have protein in their urine, which is one indicator of how healthy your heart and kidneys are. When those 5 factors are well managed, when those 5 factors are in healthy ranges, then those people in that type 2 diabetes group had little to no risk of death, heart attack, and stroke compared to the group of people that didn't have diabetes. I mean, they looked at over 250,000 people, and they were able to determine that those 5 things could make your risk of death, heart attack, and stroke, these things that we're always told that are going to cause you to have a really terrible time with diabetes, that those things are manageable, that those things don't have to happen to you. I want to move on to my diabetes dilemma, but stick around for my takeaway of the day, because I have a great analogy for you to help you kind of start thinking about reducing your risk for diabetes complications. And my hope is to kind of inject a little hope into you, because that was the whole point of this episode, not to make you feel overwhelmed by diabetes complications, but rather to recognize that diabetes complications are not a guarantee.
Diabetes dilemmas, support and answers for your diabetes questions.
My diabetes dilemma today comes from a listener who wants to know, is my primary care provider enough to help me manage my diabetes, or do I need to see a specialist like an endocrinologist? I love when you guys send me these tough questions, and this is one of those tough questions. And the reason this is a tough question is because I've seen both sides of the coin. I believe you're asking me this because you've either had an experience which made you question whether your primary care provider is the right fit for you, or maybe you feel like you're not getting enough from your primary care provider, or maybe you've just heard some of my tone in the podcast episode that there's a lot of stigmas and delays in care, and are wondering if somebody should really be seeing an endocrinologist. Here's the thing. Number one, a primary care provider can help you manage type 2 diabetes. If you are not on the same page with them, if you feel like you struggle with getting what you need from your primary care provider, then you need to find somebody different. It's not the right fit for you, for whether it's personality, whether it's somebody that just doesn't listen to you, whatever it is. If you're not getting the care you need, then it's not the right primary care provider for you. Number two, primary care providers do really want the same thing that you want. Health, little to no complications of diabetes, well-managed diabetes. Yet there is that gap there, and I see why you're asking that. There are many instances where you are needing help to help manage your blood sugars and you don't get it. Maybe it's because the primary care provider thinks another specialist is doing it. So some people get their diabetes managed by a nephrologist, somebody who specializes in kidney disease. Some people have their diabetes managed by an endocrinologist. A primary care provider might delay your care just because of the healthcare stigmas that we have about diabetes and weight. I've seen a lot of people that don't get medications started or don't get treatment plans started because the only solution that's been given to them is to lose weight. And if you've been struggling with weight and you've listened to the podcast episodes where I've interviewed people or talked about that weight isn't a sustainable plan for treating type 2 diabetes, so you really need to think about other ways to manage diabetes that doesn't include a weight as a gauge of how well you're doing, then you really understand that that's not a very feasible thing for you. And often your care is delayed. You're struggling with high blood sugars for months or years when the focus is on weight. Your primary care provider just might be overwhelmed because there have been so many medication changes and options for type 2 diabetes, even in the last 5 years. Good heavens, I went on maternity leave and there was new meds when I came back and some meds gone when I came back. I mean, it was just like, I was only gone for 3 months. What happened? So it's insane, the technology and the medication options that we have for diabetes now. It's wonderful, but so many people struggle to keep up with that. Even I do, and I'm knee deep into diabetes stuff and I love it and I suck it up every chance I get. So, your primary care provider who's responsible for managing so many other pieces of your care may not be as up to date on those pieces. And finally, the last thing to kind of consider is it would be wonderful if you could see an endocrinologist. That would be phenomenal if you could. Often, though, there's not enough of them. There's a huge national shortage of physicians who are endocrinologists. So can you see an endocrinologist? Often you can. You can ask for a referral. It's not a big deal. You could also consider an in-between kind of option where you see your primary care provider and you ask for a referral to diabetes self-management training, where you see someone like myself, who's a diabetes care and education specialist, who can help bridge the gap for you between you and your provider. Help you guys get on the same page and help advocate for you, because honestly, we often have a lot of time to assess all these different diabetes pieces and help tailor your diabetes care plan to what you need. That's something that takes a significant amount of time, and a primary care provider is limited on how much time they have with you. So bridging that gap is something that can really help, and a nice kind of in-between option if you're not able to get to an endocrinologist. Finally, most people with type 2 diabetes, not all, but most people with type 2 diabetes will shift to endocrinology care when they start using insulin. If you are struggling with high blood sugars, can't seem to get them down no matter what, and you are feeling like you're not getting what you need from your primary care provider, that's another time I see people shift into endocrinology. So those are my thoughts for you. I don't know if that answers your question straight up. I would just say trust your gut. And if you feel like you're not getting what you need from your primary care provider, that primary care provider may not be the right fit for you, or you might need that in-between gap filler like a diabetes care and education specialist. And finally, if those two things don't seem like they're getting better or seem like enough, then seeing an endocrinologist might be a great bet.
Takeaway of the day: turning your information into action.
I want to end today's episode with a visual for you. So nearly every day, most of us get into a vehicle. And when we get into that vehicle, we do it knowing that there's a potential that we could get into an accident. Yet what do you do to minimize that risk? You check your mirrors, you adjust your seat and your steering wheel, you put on a seatbelt, you make sure your blinkers work, you make sure you're looking at the speed limit and you're not going crazy miles per hour. You do all those things because you know there's potential that you could get into a car accident. And if you have those pieces in place, that car accident's less likely. And if you have a seatbelt on, you know that if you did get into a car accident, your injuries would be smaller and less damaging. So all of those things that you do to prepare yourself to decrease your risk of accidents or to minimize any harm that would happen from an accident should be just like what you do for diabetes. You do the exact same thing. You have diabetes. There is a chance that you would develop complications from diabetes. Yet you can put on your seatbelts, you can turn on your blinkers, you can make sure your lights work and your airbags work, and all of these other pieces are in place to minimize or decrease that risk. You can go to your doctor routinely, so that way they can check you over every 3 months and make sure that nothing has changed, that you're not starting to develop any complications of diabetes. Because if you are starting to develop complications, we can nip it in the bud. Your healthcare team can help you minimize what that complication can do to your body. So this is what I want you to take away from this episode. Diabetes complications are not a guarantee, and you have a lot more power than you think to minimize that risk. That's it for today's episode. But next week, I'm going to be talking about adding activity into your daily routine. And I'm going to use your built environment. So if you've never heard of a built environment, have no idea what that is and what I'm talking about, tune in next week. And until then, don't forget, the number one thing you can do to manage your diabetes is bet on you.
Keep current on new episodes by subscribing to Type 2 and You with Meg. Be sure to share a link of today's episode to someone you know living with Type 2 diabetes. Want to learn more about today's topic or need answers to your diabetes dilemmas? Contact Megan by using the links in the podcast description or visiting her webpage, type2andyou.org. This podcast is for informational purposes only and not intended as medical advice.